Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. One key bit of advice and reasoning that Plutarch is going to provide us with in his treatise On Tranquility has to do with this unreasonable desire that we often have and attempts to put that desire into practice, to do it all, to have it all. And he thinks that this is unrealistic and that we really need to, as he's going to say a little bit later, follow the Delphic maxim, know yourself, which also implies know who you aren't, namely everybody else. So he begins this section by talking about our need to, it's translated as manage, it's actually chresai, which means to use or to deal with our impulse or impulses, hormais. These are very basic affectivities in ancient Greek moral psychology. So think of our drives, our desires, the tendencies that we have, our orientation, you could say. So managing those well, and we need to do that in relation to our capacity, our dunamis, our ability to do something. And you could think of this as in terms of temperaments or talents, whatever it is that you want to include under capacity. And he says that in our expectations, now expectations is actually the word for hope, elpis, elpisin in this case, and we aim at menus, right? We drive for things that are too great in those expectations or hopes that we have, and that is going to produce unhappiness in place of contentment. So we fail inevitably, and then we get upset with our destiny, our fortune, as he's going to say, our daimon and our touche in Greek, instead of getting upset with ourselves for being stupid, for expecting more than can actually happen. And so he's going to give you some great examples of the sorts of things that people want to have all at once. He says that not only do people demand at the same time to be rich, so to have more wealth than everybody else, and to be learned or thoughtful, logioi, and to be strong, iskoroi. That's in the body, right? So we're combining a rich guy and a smart guy and a really buff guy together. That's already tough to find. And then he says, and also convivial spirits and good company, literally sympotikoi. So sympotikoi, that's the word we get symposium from. It means a drinking party where you're a good guest, right? You're a good companion. Convivial is a good translation. And then pleasant, hades. That's another great way of translating good company. And so that's already tough to do. And then he adds two more things in there. Being friends of kings, being friends of people who really matter, and ruling over cities. It's translated here as magistrates. It literally just means to be a ruler, archontes, over cities. And they think that they're deserving of this sort of stuff. Axion is the verb there. And it's tough to combine just a few of these things together. Is anybody really going to have all of those things? Probably not. I mean, if they do, it's going to be like 1 in a million, quite literally. And so he's going to look at a few examples here. He also talks about other things, having dogs, horses, quails, and roosters that win prizes, right? And so he talks about the elder Dionysos, who is this tyrant, wasn't content with being the greatest tyrant, so being a ruler, a king of his age, but because he could not sing verses better than the poet Philoxenus, or get the better of Plato in dialectic, he threw Philoxenus into the stone quarries and he sold Plato into slavery, as you know, blaming them essentially for his own incapacity. And, you know, if you are a tyrant, are you going to also be able to do these things? We can think about some of the Roman emperors who wanted to not just rule, but also best everybody in writing poetry and music. What about Alexander the Great? Now, he was a guy with many flaws. You read other parts of Plutarch's work and others' works. You know, he's prone to anger, but at least he didn't think that he was a better racer than everybody else. And so he's racing against a famous sprinter, and the sprinter seems to like slow down deliberately, and Alexander gets indignant with him, right? Achilles, who's the greatest warrior in the host at Troy, says, "Of the bronze-clad Achaeans, none is a match for me." And then immediately says, well, in war, I'm really, really good at that, but in speaking, others are better than I am. Who's better than he is? Odysseus, mentor. All these thoughtful people, right? And then he talks about this guy, this Persian Megabyzus, who comes to talk to this famous artist, Apelles, and tries to chatter with him about art. And Apelles says, "So long as you kept still, you seemed to be somebody because of your gold and purple, wearing beautiful stuff. But now even the boys who grind the pigments are laughing at your nonsense," meaning you just look like a jackass. You embarrassed yourself trying to talk art with those of us who actually know it. And, you know, we can think of many people in our own time that are also doing that. And then he talks about the Stoic sage. Now, Plutarch is a Middle Platonist. The Stoics are a rival school. The Stoics have a lot of ideas that not only Plutarch, but many other people thought kind of don't make sense. And one of them has to do with the idea of the sage, or the legendary wise person. So the official Stoic doctrine, summarized here, is that the wise person is not only possessing the virtues like being prudent and just and brave, but they're also an orator, a poet, a general, a rich man, and a king, and they're worthy of all of these titles, right? So basically, if you read some Stoic literature, the wise person can do it all. They're, again, 1 in a million, right? There's a quip somewhere along the line that the sage is like the legendary phoenix, maybe one arises every 500 years. So what happens if you have this mindset? And you're like, oh man, if I can't do it all, then I must not be worth anything. And that's a wrong-headed point of view. So Plutarch thinks that this raising the bar so high could actually be bad for people practicing Stoicism. And then he points out that even the Greek gods have different domains that they're in charge of, right? He says that different gods hold different powers. One is warlike, another prophetic, another gain-bringing. Zeus dispatches Aphrodite to marriages on the ground that she has no part in deeds of war. As a matter of fact, in Homer's Iliad, when she does get on the battlefield, she almost gets herself killed, in part because Athena puts out a hit on her with a Greek hero's Diomedes, who is able to actually see her, and she has to be saved, right? So different gods are doing different things. Why would it be otherwise for us? So that's already some good advice. We can say, all right, so even if the divine beings can't do it all, there's no Stoic sage around to look at, we're all going to have some limitations. We can't do everything. Going further than that, so here's another reasoning process. some of our occupations are actually not going to be compatible with each other. So he says that there are some which cannot by their very nature exist together, but they're actually opposites, hypernantiusai. That means that they are opposed to each other in a very strong way. So what are some examples of this? Study of rhetoric or mathematics that requires a lot of time and patience and leisure and not being disturbed by other things. Political functions and the friendship of king cannot succeed without hard work and full occupation of one's time. So if you want to do both of those, you're probably not going to be successful with either. Pick one and you can do that. Wine and indulgence in meat make the body strong and vigorous, but the soul weak. So if you want to overeat and do exercise all day, you probably can't be particularly intellectual. Unremitting care to acquire and preserve money increases wealth, but contempt and disdain for it is conducive to progress in philosophy. So you can't do everything. And this might be even more so today when we have more things that we can study. And so he's going to suggest you really need to think about this Delphic maxim, know thyself. But don't just know yourself. There's some corollary that should follow from that for action. He says use, again we have this term kresai, right? Use your own self for the life for which you actually arose, pephuke, right? Here it's translated as the life that nature has fitted you, but literally means the life that you arose naturally for. So we all have to figure out where our talents lie and cultivate those, and don't worry about the gaps or blind spots, because somebody else is going to have that as their nature, right? And so he gives you a bunch of different examples of this. It says the horse is for the chariot, the ox is for the plow, right? A man is out of his wits who's annoyed and pained that he's not at the same time a lion and a little Maltese dog cuddled in the lap of a widow. And you can't wish to be both an Empedocles or a Plato or a Democritus, and like Euphorion to be married to a wealthy old woman, or to be like Medius, one of Alexander's companions, and drink with him, right? You can't have all of these things together. And he says, look at this. When people do athletic things, runners are not discouraged because they don't carry off wrestlers' crowns. That would be stupid of them. They do running rather than wrestling. They exalt and rejoice in their own. He also brings up this guy Strato, the natural philosopher, and he sees that Menedemus has more pupils than him, and he says, that's fine, Why be surprised if there's more who wish to bathe than be anointed for the contest? And he goes on with many other examples as well. He's got some funny ones here about different beasts and being able to eat different things, and that's a good reflection as well. Now, some animals actually are pretty omnivorous, but most of them need certain stuff. And we're going to close here with a really interesting passage that is not quite at the conclusion of this, but is very rich, particularly when we think about the words that are being used. If we don't take stock of who we actually are, if we don't know ourselves, he says we are going to slander ourselves, we're going to be displeased, and we're going to despise our lives as living an incomplete and trivial life. Now, there's a lot of stuff to unpack here. So slandering ourselves is not the word that we would normally associate with this, diabolein. It's instead sycophantumen. So a sycophant, we usually think of that as somebody who's a suck-up, a flatterer, right? They were also people who would report other people for having done crimes and get them in trouble. So, here in America, we sometimes call them colloquially narcs. In British English, they call that grassing on somebody. We all have a lot of terms for turning somebody else in. Now, you're doing that to yourself. You're reporting your own weaknesses to who? To the world, to yourself, to, you're doing it with somebody. And then being displeased, acharistumen. So this is coming from the privative a, and then charis is a really important Greek term that means both joy and gratitude. So being displeased and ungrateful, if we want to translate it fully. And then despising, so kataphronontes, right? So kataphronein means to look down upon or think down upon. To despise is another way of translating it. And we're doing this to ourselves or our life, and we're treating our life, the way that we're living it, which is actually a verb here, as incomplete or lacking something, and daos. And then there's actually, in the text, there's a term that doesn't really make sense, that is in a lot of the manuscripts, eutelos, coming to a good end. But a lot of the commentators substitute atelos, which makes a lot more sense. Trivial, not having a purpose, not having a goal, not having a telos. So if we try to have it all because we're, unthoughtful, immoderate in our desires that have to do with this, desire for primacy, being number one, and winning, philonikos, right? We're doing this all out of self-love, he says. If we allow that to lead us into not really knowing ourselves, we're going to screw ourselves up. And instead of being tranquil, we're going to be unhappy throughout the life. No matter how much we actually accomplish, it'll never be enough.